Understanding both the position and the resistance profiles it again goes back to making sure you're trying to get the appropriate stimulus or maybe training the muscle to a sufficient degree of fatigue through all of its positions and ranges. Not understanding that can lead to sometimes people doing what we call redundant exercises, where it's basically you're doing the same exercise, but you're at a different station in the gym, right? So an example would be someone does a dumbbell press and then they do a barbell press on a flat bench. It's like, well, the implement was different. Maybe one's a little more stable, but the muscle position is the same. The path of motion is the same. The resistance profile is essentially the same. You're basically doing the same exercise.
Today's episode is with guest Cody Moxley. Cody is a certified sports nutritionist, coach, and the CFO for N1 Education and Training. In today's episode, we're nerding out on lots of exercise and training related topics and tips. Cody is going to break down a few of the more complex biomechanics terms so you have a general understanding of what they mean and how these things play into your personal training protocols. So things like lengthen versus shorten muscles, resistance profiles, sensation versus stimulation, mind-muscle connection, and a few others as well. Cody is also going to clear up some of the misconceptions when it comes to females and training, as well as dive into a few of the issues surrounding evidence-based research and why you shouldn't always believe what you read, even if it's coming from a well-established scientific journal. It was great to reconnect with Cody, and I know you're going to take a lot away from this episode. Let's get into it. All right, welcome back to MetFlex and Chill. This is Rachel Gregory, your host, and I'm here with Cody Moxley. What's up, Cody? How are you today?
I am doing great. How are you?
I'm good. I'm excited to have you here. We were chatting a little bit off air. I was around your stomping grounds back in October, and we kind of chatted about doing this podcast. So it's been a long time coming. I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to dive into kind of some basics around biomechanics. As well as clearing up some of the confusions and misconceptions when it comes to females and training specifically. So before we do that, do you want to give our viewers and listeners just a quick background on you, how you got into the nutrition and training space?
So I kind of was self-taught through college, university, and then once I graduated, I was more on the digital side of the fitness industry, working on marketing for a fitness company, and then kind of moved into writing articles, programs, and then kind of shifted into coaching. And during that job, I met the guys I work with now, CISSN and Adam, for a couple of years. And then we started kind of our own thing, or CISSN started N1. And then we've been doing that ever since, focusing on the education side of fitness, educating coaches to help improve their ability to, essentially help their clients.
Gotcha. Yeah. And if you haven't heard of N1 before, shame on you if you listen. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, you guys are doing awesome things in this space. I mean, just coming out to the practical a few months ago, I think I told you this, but I feel like I learned the amount that I learned in those 4 days was probably like more than I learned in like one semester of grad school, in terms of just like being able to, apply the science and all of that to the actual practical application, which I think is a huge piece that's missing, especially in like the education side of things. Like when it comes to even getting your master's in exercise physiology or nutrition, like I did, there's just a huge gap from, what you're learning in the textbook or in the classroom to what you can actually apply practically. And there's also just kind of a gap in the research, I think, from like the old textbooks to like what the new research is saying. And I think there's just a lot of a gap there. So I love what you guys are doing all around. So
yeah, like you said, there's definitely a big gap between just teaching you intellectual knowledge and memorizing things, and then getting out and being able to apply that in the real world. And that's kind of been the main focus of why N1 was created, is to bridge that gap. It's like, yeah, we have to talk about the theory and to start out, but I'd say probably, when you came to the practical, it's like 75-80% of that we're on the floor doing stuff and doing it ourselves. So and like you said, we get that a lot from people even after their formal degrees or multiple certifications over 2-3 decades even, and just sometimes the knowledge gap, like you said, of being able to turn that into how do I write a program for X, Y, Z person? It's a little startling at first.
Yeah, for sure. Um, awesome. Well, I have a bunch of questions for you and topics that I want to dive into. So let's get started before we run out of time, because I'm sure we're gonna run out of time before. I'm always very ambitious about like all the topics, and then I end up getting through like 2 questions. So, but hopefully get through a few more. But I did want to start off just kind of talking about general biomechanics, some of the terms that we're seeing a lot more kind of in, especially I would say like on, social media platforms and things like that, at least from what I see. There's a lot more of these kind of terms that are coming up that have not been kind of mainstream, especially for people who are maybe not coaches themselves, but they are, following people who are posting about, biomechanics, or posting about, resistance curves and resistance profiles, and like, what the heck does that even mean? So I wanted to kind of take, a little bit of time for you to kind of go through some of these terms and maybe like define them in layman's terms, so people can really understand, what they are and why they even matter when it comes to training and exercise selection and all of that. So the first kind of concept that tends to be very confusing for people is the difference between shortened and lengthened ranges and how that applies to different exercises. So maybe you can just kind of bring us through, what those are, why they matter for your training, and break it down for us.
Yeah. So basically, we're just talking about at that point what relative length the muscle is. Is it close to its fully lengthened or stretched position? Or is it close to when it's fully contracted, fully shortened? You have all that cross bridging of the actin and myosin, all that kind of stuff. That's just kind of the very basic terms of what the muscle is. And then when we look at the position, that's really more of like where your joints and bones and where those are, and how that either stretches or shortens the muscle. Like as you're going through that range, it's lengthening and shortening. And then the reason that becomes more important is actually when you start getting into the programming side of things. And we talk a lot about stimulus. What is the stimulus we are trying to create in that muscle tissue or for your nervous system, which essentially relates more to what is our goal of training? What are we trying to accomplish or achieve? So understanding these positions, that actually ends up relating to, mechanical stresses or metabolic stresses or other things we're trying to create with the program. So a very simple example would be, generally, if we're, spending a lot of time in a lengthened range or lengthened position of a muscle, we're going to failure. We're doing a lot of work, in fatigue. We increase the potential of, say, creating mechanical trauma, mechanical damage in that tissue, which may be a good thing if that's our goal, but maybe at other times we don't want to be creating that stimulus at that time. So then understanding, okay, maybe I want to avoid those positions for a short time if I want to avoid that stimulus. Same thing for the shortened position. Maybe we're, that would be the opposite effect, right? So if we're trying to stay in more of our shortened ranges, we're trying to avoid lengthened positions because we don't want to create too much mechanical trauma, or sometimes spending more time in the short position can allow us to create a little bit more metabolic stress, or to a greater degree. Maybe we try and spend more times there in a metabolic or a conditioning type of program, right? So it's very relative, but that's kind of a very general overview of why we would want to understand what those positions are to essentially help us in our exercise selection when we're trying to design programs a little bit more specifically.
Gotcha. And for anybody who's listening that kind of just like, still, I have no idea what you're talking about. Can you maybe just give some examples of like general exercises that would be more, focus more on the shortened position versus length, and then ones that are more focused on the lengthened position, just so people kind of understand a little bit more like, oh, okay, now I understand. And this might get into the next question I have, which is, resistance profiles and resistance curves. So maybe we can kind of meld that together however you want.
Yep. Okay, so I mean, like a very simple example there would be if we're talking about like training quads or knee extension. We're training a leg extension where we're in hip flexion and your knee is fully extended. That would be the shortened position of all of your quadriceps. So that would be a shortened position exercise. And then if you have like a hack squat or a squat or something where you can reach full knee flexion and it's loaded there, you're reaching the lengthened position of most of the quads. And that would be like a lengthened position exercise. And in that case, it's also a lengthened overloaded exercise in the case of a squat or a hack squat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. That's a good example. And then just another example would be like, for example, a glute bridge, like a barbell glute bridge would be more in the shortened position versus like an RDL is you're challenging more the lengthened position, correct?
Yeah. So, I mean, part of that may depend on what degree of knee bend you're in. If we're hitting lengthened hamstrings before lengthened glutes. And that's, again, where we start getting into kind of the nuances of exercises and execution of those exercises can change what we're getting where, if that makes sense. So in the RDL example, if we're including a little bit more knee bend, getting closer to an actual deadlift, we may be hitting full hip flexion for and full lengthened position of the glutes in that position. Whereas, like you said, the glute bridge is going to be more of a shortened position for the glutes.
Gotcha. And so when it comes to like resistance profiles and resistance curves, that term is interchangeable. What, maybe you can define that for us, and then I'll have other questions after that.
So the easiest way to understand that is it just is a term that talks about if you were to draw a graph of where an exercise is hard, and you imagine the x-axis is like lengthened to shortened or shortened to lengthened, and then your y-axis is degree of difficulty. If you were to plot that graph of where an exercise is hard, and you were to look at how that curve goes, that's all the resistance curve or resistance profile. That's what that refers to, a visualization of where an exercise is most challenging, least challenging, etc.
Gotcha. And can you maybe give us another example of like I guess I'm trying to get across too, for practical reasons, like when you see someone training, like if it's a leg day, right? And one of the reasons why you want to be training your muscles through different ranges of motion so you can stimulate, the full range of motion of that, the full active range of motion of that muscle. But where do you see people making the most mistakes, maybe when it comes to like their training program, or maybe a training program that someone else wrote for them, where maybe they're just training a ton of exercises like in more of the lengthened position or not even hitting the shortened position? Maybe you can kind of just talk about that a little bit from a practical standpoint.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, understanding both the position and the resistance profiles it again goes back to making sure you're trying to get the appropriate stimulus, or maybe training the muscle to a sufficient degree of fatigue through all of its positions and ranges. Not understanding that can lead to sometimes people doing what we call redundant exercises, where it's basically you're doing the same exercise, but you're at a different station in the gym, right? So an example would be someone does a dumbbell press and then they do a barbell press on a flat bench. It's like, well, the implement was different. Maybe one's a little more stable, but the muscle position is the same. The path of motion is the same. The resistance profile is essentially the same. You're basically doing the same exercise. So could you potentially swap one of those for something else that would allow you to create more tension in the muscle, or get a little bit more work through more of the range of motion, like a fly or a machine press that maybe has a different resistance profile, where it's not just completely hard in the lengthen and then drops off or isn't as challenging in the short. Maybe it's the reverse of that. So
gotcha. Yeah, you explained that exactly how I was looking for it. And it's basically just kind of understanding that even though an exercise might have a different name, or like you said, maybe you're using a different piece of equipment, they can essentially be very, very similar, and you could be just doing kind of the same thing back to back and fatiguing yourself, but not getting the full effect that you could if you were to incorporate different exercises together that complement each other, for example. So awesome. Cool. Kind of transitioning similar to, just thinking about that as well, is more so the term mind muscle connection. So I feel like that's something that it took me kind of a long time to even understand that as well. And I always thought, oh, like mind muscle connection is just feeling the muscle, right? Like feeling it work, or whatever you want to, having that kind of sensation in there and feeling that. So what is maybe you can define mind muscle connection from your perspective, and like what we should actually be focusing on when it comes to that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think a better or more helpful definition of that would be conscious control rather than, where you're feeling something working, right? Because there's a lot of things that can create a feeling that doesn't necessarily mean we're creating quality tension in what we're trying to do. So yeah, I think conscious control is a better example. So for, let's say, most people learn how to, squeeze their arm and flex their bicep. And it's like, oh, okay, I feel something in my bicep. It's like, okay, cool. So you have the ability to contract that tissue on demand. That's what you've achieved without holding any weights or any other force. You can contract tissue in that area at will. That's a very simplified version of what mind muscle connection is. And then as you get more advanced, you get better, essentially control, neurological coordination throughout your body from just years of practice and training. You can begin to do that in other tissues, or you can begin to differentiate when you're feeling tension in maybe even a division of a muscle more than another. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're chasing, these different types of sensations, which is probably where we're going next with this.
Yeah.
We'll talk about more. But understanding the differences in feeling what is occurring in your body. So for example, being able to, kind of one of the milestones for some guys when they start training is being able to do the pec pop. Like, can you contract one pec or the other, like as you want? Right. So that it's the similar thing is like, can you contract that tissue without like having to grab a dumbbell or a barbell and push into something? Right. So hopefully that makes sense. It's a control aspect, not just, can I do something that makes me feel something in this area? It's a little more specific than that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think talking about kind of sensation versus stimulation, as you were saying, getting into that a little bit, I think it'll make a little bit more sense. And maybe we can kind of talk about some of the common examples of some exercises that you might, well, first of all, I'm getting ahead of myself here. So sensation versus stimulation, what is the difference between those? And what mistakes do you feel like a lot of people are making when it comes to choosing exercises where they might feel a lot of that sensation, but it might not actually be stimulating what we want or working what we actually want to be working?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. So when we first started talking about like the sensation versus tension thing, part of what's hard for maybe people to wrap their mind around is we're not saying that all sensation is bad. It's learning what types of sensation are okay. That's maybe a tension or a type of thing I want to feel versus, oh, that's my nervous system freaking out because I'm jamming my joint or doing something I shouldn't. And that's when we're kind of trying to find, all right, what type of sensation is quote unquote not what we're going for, not tension. That tends to be more when it's the sharp, what we call it, like a crampy sensation. That's, typically your nervous system going, oh, hey, alert, hello, hi, don't do that, I don't like it. Versus, you pick up a heavy dumbbell and you're like, there's something happening in my bicep, but it's not like, ooh, ow. There's something happening, if that makes sense. And then understanding that tension is going to, quote unquote, feel different in different positions, right? So having tension in the short position of a muscle, like we talked about short and lengthen, is going to feel very different than having that same tension in the lengthened position of the muscle, right? It's not always like if you do that, squeeze it in the short position, you're like, okay, that feeling, I understand that feeling. And then trying to achieve that same feeling in the lengthened position, it's not going to happen. Or if it does, that's probably not a good thing because it's a different signal that we're creating essentially. So maybe if I go a little further there, typically in the short position, we have a lot of tissue kind of, shortening. We have pressure pushing outwards on, the fascia and surrounding tissue as that muscle shortens. So there's a pressure sensation pushing against the other tissues. That's just how the muscle works. When it shortens, it's going to get a little bit, quote unquote, thicker, if that makes sense. Whereas when we get the lengthened position, we no longer have that tension pushing outward. We have tension, essentially on the, tendons are always there. but we don't have that pressure sensation. So it's a different type of feeling, which is where, talking about sensation can be a little bit more, nuanced, for lack of a better term, because you don't have, oh, I squeezed this here. Okay, now how do I feel that same thing at every part of the range? It's like, that's not how that works.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes sense. And I guess maybe breaking down a few common exercises that that are out there that people do a lot, where they think that they're maybe, getting a lot of tension somewhere because they feel it, they feel that sensation, but it might just be either their nervous system or their joints, sending that signal back. So maybe, like, I don't know, putting you on the spot here, what are like the top 3 exercises that you see people doing that you're like, oh man, like you could be doing something way better than that?
Let's see. Well, the first 2 that come to mind, just because there's so many glute things that are off the wall, frog pumps and basically knee banded hip extension things would be the
Okay.
top 2. And then the third would be maybe like the super high shoulder flexion, like supination type curl things. Or they're, super high shoulder flexion and they're really trying to supinate and then elbow flex. That can create kind of a crampy sensation. But probably the other one would be like the lying down lateral raise, where you're actually laying on your back doing like cable lateral raise type movement. That can be a very sensation based exercise as well. So I'd probably say that I would say would rank higher than the bicep exercise.
Gotcha. And so there are a lot of females listening to this podcast. So when it comes to certain exercises, especially glute focus exercises, so like you said, the frog pump,
Mm-hmm.
like why would the frog pump not be a great movement? And like, what would you choose over that?
So what I would choose over that would be basically almost anything else. A glute bridge, or like a cable kick back, like we did when you were here at the practical, would both be better options. Even just a general hip thrust. But if our goal is, training the short position, a glute bridge would be probably the number 1 choice. A 45-degree hip extension, that's a good option too. Very stable, easy to focus on just training glutes or hip extension things. And part of the reason those become issues is because they're people feel them, but it's not because it's a lot of tension in the glutes. It's typically, one, it's kind of putting you in a joint jam position. There's a lot of what's called co-contraction, which is where you have agonists and antagonists contracting against one another around a joint to try and create stability in an otherwise unstable position. So that, that nervous system, they're essentially fighting themselves to try and keep you from popping your hip out of its socket. And then you have people not knowing what it is they're feeling. They just know it's in a general area. So what you would also have is people feeling their piriformis maybe working, which is underneath the glutes. And they're like, oh, I feel it in my glutes. I'm like, well, you feel it near your glutes, but it's not necessarily the glute max doing a whole lot of work. It's usually this little muscle underneath it that you're feeling, but they don't know. They're just like, over this area, I feel something here, but that's where my glutes are. So that must be glutes. It's like, well, not exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. And if
That's
you're
not to
trying to
say,
like, oh, sorry.
I was going to say, that's not to say that glutes aren't creating any tension. They
Mhm.
are, but not nearly to the degree that, you're taxing other structures. You could be putting that effort to much better use elsewhere or in another modality.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Especially like if your goal is to glow, grow your glutes to, as efficiently as you can and as fast as possible. Like you're going to want to be working your biggest glute muscle as much as you can, which is your glute max. So, yeah, choosing efficient exercise with that. In terms of, I want to talk about the bands for a second, like booty bands and things like that. Because those are a hot commodity these days. But before I get into that, I do want to mention, so the abduction machine, so the machine, if you're listening to this and, the machine that you go and you sit on and you kind of spread your legs. What are they?
The
There's
good
like,
girl, bad girl
yes,
machine.
the good girl, bad girl machine. Let's talk about that. Like, is there any effectiveness to that? Is it still kind of just like you were talking about the frog punch, just working the piriformis, or like, tell us about that machine.
Yeah. Well, I mean, number one rule is you never make eye contact with anyone while you're on that machine. Um,
Yes,
but
definitely.
yeah. So when you're in the hip flex position, that seated position, it is going to be more biased towards the piriformis wanting to do that motion, because from that position, the glutes would actually want to extend your hip, which you can't do in that machine. So it's not really going to be a good exercise for training the glutes directly. That's not to say that training your piriformis is bad, because it's not. It's a muscle. Getting it stronger is not going to be a bad thing, but maybe putting a ton of volume in that little tiny muscle, maybe not a great idea. So, it's not an awful machine, but just know what it is and what it's actually doing when you're putting it in your program, not thinking, oh, I'm going to do 10 sets of this to get bigger glutes. Why aren't my glutes growing? Right. A modification, and we're actually working on this, if you wanted to use it for glutes, and it would actually be more for glute minimus, would be if you could do it lying back, like lying flat on your back, and then do the hip abduction. That would be more of a glute minimus type of exercise, which is that division that's more on the side of your hip, rather than mostly piriformis. So that would be another option. If you have, if perhaps you find a machine where the back pad lays down, or you can take the back pad off and you can lay down, something like that.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. And then getting into, because you mentioned the bands a little bit, let's talk about that, because I feel like, there is, I don't know, there's some people who are like, bands are like, use bands all the time. And there's people who are like, you should never use bands, right? So like, where's the middle ground? And like, what, in your perspective and just opinion from working with clients and obviously doing all the research you do, like, where do those booty bands come into play in terms of maybe being, practical for use versus like where are they actually maybe doing you a disservice?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, trying to increase the challenge of a hip extension exercise by adding more bands around your thighs is going to be counterproductive, because you're essentially putting a lot more work resisting the force that's trying to adduct you by abducting, which is going to be using, again, that glute minimus. And then while trying to simultaneously do hip extension, it's going to be essentially working against yourself, for lack of a better term. We go through this more in the biomechanics course that
And
you
just anybody listening who didn't see you do that motion, because like this is on obviously YouTube and listening. So for abduction, adduction, can you just like tell us what that means?
Yes. So adduction, adduction just means coming in towards your midline. So that would be like knees together if you're doing a glute or an adductor thing. And then abduction or abduction is stuff moving away from the midline of your body. So this would be the knees out cue that you might hear.
Gotcha. Okay. Just want to make sure.
Yes, I know sometimes it's hard. It's like, do we have video? Or are we just doing audio? Yeah. So with the bands, I would say the most application for those would be if you don't have a better option and you're trying to, just say you have people working out at home. It's like, well, I don't have a cable machine. I can't do cable kickbacks and all these other type of exercises. Well, then, okay, we could still potentially use bands to do some glute stuff. And we actually, when we went into lockdowns the first time back in 2020, we did a home workout library with several of these exercises where you can use the thigh bands, but you're not doing like monster walks and those type of things. We're actually doing like, I'm doing a hip extension with one leg and the other leg is planted. So now that band is actually resisting the path of motion that the glutes would be working in. Or doing, like I said, a glute minimus exercise where you're just standing on one leg and you abduct or kick one leg out straight out laterally, right? We're not doing it in hip flexion, because then that goes back to, okay, that's going to be working more piriformis. Mm-hmm. So there are ways you can use bands to your advantage. But if you have a cable machine, you can use other exercises at your disposal. Those may be a little more helpful. That's not to say bands are evil, right? It just depends how you use them. But when we get to things like, putting, these, monster bands on your thighs while trying to do a glute bridge, that's when it's like, okay, that's probably not a good application for those. Or I've seen some interesting ones where they'll actually be like banded around their ankles and then doing a squat or a leg press. I'm like, I don't think you understand physics. because your feet are planted. There's nothing pulling your, like, why?
Yeah.
I don't get it. But that's neither,
Yeah.
that's, all kinds of funny stuff
Yeah.
on social media.
Yeah. So I guess band around your knees when you're doing a hip thrust or a squat, where would like the issues, like why are there issues there? You kind of already talked about this, but specifically for a squat, for example, I've seen that a lot, or, people use that maybe in a learning phase or something like that. Is there like any application for that, or what would you say?
That's not something I would ever use, even as a learning tool, because it may end up leading to poor movement patterns down the future. If you're set up correctly, and this is one of the big things we really harp on with our biomechanics stuff, is like, if the setup is correct, your nervous system can figure out what to do if you don't already have some movement pattern ingrained otherwise, if that makes sense. So like when you were here and we were talking about the squat, it's like, how many, like, other than moving your feet position or essentially changing your setup, did we give you any other cues?
Nope.
Nope. And we didn't have to, right? So
Yeah.
that's the thing, is like, the better we get at setting these exercises up,
Hmm.
you don't need a whole lot, cue wise, unless somebody already has a cue in their head that you're trying to counteract because it's a bad cue. So even back to like the banded knees thing, sometimes that's a cue or something people use because their knees are falling in or something. So it's like, oh, okay, well, I need to get them to push their knees out. I'm going to give them a band to push against, when it's like, well, maybe their foot position was just off. If you move their feet in closer, or maybe move their toes out a little bit, and now they do the squat, are their knees still falling in? Probably not. So it's more of a learning gap, I would say, on the people coaching the exercises that lead to some of these things, which is, again, that's why it's such a big emphasis for us, is like, we need to kind of backtrack and figure out where these things came from, how can we make it better, and then how do we get it out to as many people as possible so that we don't start seeing, these crazy, 5 bands around the knees doing squats type of things.
Yeah, for sure. No, that makes sense. Awesome. Okay. So I feel like we kind of got through all the biomechanics stuff, and I don't even know. Yeah, we're like 30 minutes in. So do you still have like 20-ish minutes left to chat? All right,
Absolutely.
cool. Awesome. So I want to talk a little bit more about, like I mentioned, there's a lot of females listening. There are males as well. So shout out to all the males listening to podcasts, but lots of females. And I want to talk a little bit about kind of some of the misconceptions out there when it comes to training, and setting up training programs for, females specifically. So we hear a lot about, setting up your training around your cycle, or, women should be training differently than men, or, just a bunch of different things. So I want to kind of just get your perspective on that, and maybe kind of dive into some of the most common misconceptions that you hear when it comes to females versus males training.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so to the cycle thing, there's a lot of individual variability within just that. It's like, not every female cycle affects them in the same way, right? So not everyone has a week where it's like, oh, I feel like crap, I'm tired, I'm exhausted, I'm bloated, I don't want to move. Some of them are just fine. It's like, oh, okay, it's that week, I'm good, let's train. Like, so you have to take that with a grain of salt. And I think sometimes the marketing gimmicks get the better of people, and they kind of buy into this, oh, I have to do this because of X, Y, and Z. It's like, well, try training that week. How do you feel? I feel fine. Okay, then do we need to deload that week? Then no, probably not. But also understanding, like, when we're doing check-ins and things, oh, my weight is up this week. It's like, is it that time of month? Oh yeah. It's like, okay, I'm not worried about it. Like, let's just keep going about our thing. You're doing great. Keep it up. So yeah, not I think trying to write programs around a 4-week cycle is more trouble than it's worth sometimes, both from a client and a coach perspective. And if we're just following basically the same stuff we teach in our courses, of understanding, like, what are the signs of someone's hitting their limit of this training stimulus, they have too much volume, they need more food, they need more sleep, like all these other things. If you follow those exact same principles, it's going to lead you to the best possible outcome for that person. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree. I went through periods of time just for myself, and then also programming for clients, where I was like trying to fit the program like to their cycle. And then I realized like exactly what you said. There's so many other variables that are involved with that. And like you said, everybody is so different. So I've never had like that much luck trying to write a training program around an individual cycle, unless it's like, it's really just making modifications as things come up, right? And knowing how to do that and kind of working through that. And having the data there, right? Like actually looking at the data and be like, okay, like these last 3 months, here's the trends that we saw with your energy levels or the bloating or the scale or whatever, and your ability to recover from your workout during, you know, the time of your cycle. So if that's trending the same over like 3 months, for example, and we actually have the data to look at that, then it's like, okay, yeah, it's been 3 months of the same thing. We can kind of make some modifications there. But that's another thing too. Like a lot of people don't even track the actual data. So it's like, how do you even know?
Yeah. Well, and that's part of our jobs as coaches too, is like making them aware and then empowering them to make those decisions kind of on the fly. If they're like, oh, I'm not feeling so hot today, but coach said this is my workout, so I got to do it, you know, better than last week. It's like, no, if you feel like garbage, it's okay to back off on a day. You're not going to lose all your gains. You're not going to like shoot yourself in the foot progress wise. It's okay to back off if you're not feeling well, because if you go hard now, it might affect you for the next couple of days versus, okay, I'm going to take it a little bit easier today, you know, maybe just focus on my execution a little bit more or something, and then I'll be fine, you know, tomorrow or the next day. And then, like you said, just making them aware of tracking how that stuff affects them, all those kind of things. So yeah, that's part of the coach client relationship too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Awesome. So there's another kind of topic I want to talk about, and it kind of piggybacks off of this, but the concept of junk volume and kind of diving into that. And especially, at least for me, I used to be, I feel like I still struggle with this, but always kind of, you know, wanting to do more, or, you know, kind of that type A personality where it's just like go, 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 and like never let myself recover. I've gotten way better at that. But I do work with a lot of women who that's like kind of just, it's like if they're not training 6 days a week, if they're not, you know, training for more than an hour, like they're not doing as much as they should be doing. Whereas realizing kind of the difference between, you know, effective training and effective volume and junk training, junk volume. So can we talk a little bit about that? You know, what even is junk volume and why does it matter?
Yep. Yeah. Well, so first off, you're not a bad person if you do junk volume. I've been there. We've all been there. I was a master of running myself into the ground 6 days a week. So yeah. But so junk volume, just simply put, is any work that either does not contribute directly to the stimulus of your workout or is in excess of the amount of work you can recover from, right? So there's two different things we have to look at there. And so this again comes back to, you have to know the goal of your workout. What are you specifically training to achieve in this session? And sometimes I'll ask them like, all right, what stimulus or what is the goal of this session? And they'll be like, hypertrophy. I'm like, that's not specific enough, because there's a lot of ways we can achieve that. Are we trying to go for more of a metabolic stimulus? Are we trying to create more mechanical damage like we talked about earlier? Are we trying to maximize just the total volume of work in that tissue, again, that we can recover from? So there's a lot of different, are we going for systemic conditioning? Are we going for, you know, are you just trying to get really strong? Those are all different goals. And the way we approach the volume on those things all differ. So for example, some of the misconceptions I've heard around junk volume is that, oh, if you're anything, you know, whatever, below X RPE or X RIR or certain level of intensity is junk volume. Like anything less than a 7 RPE is junk volume. It's like, well, maybe in some cases, yes, but in others, no. So for example, maybe you've seen like some of the programs and things where we do like the incomplete rest method, where it's like, we do 8 sets of 8 reps with 30 seconds rest, and you use the same weight the whole time. It's like, well, in order to achieve that, those first 2 or 3 sets are pretty darn easy. Those are maybe like a 4 or a 5 RPE, but they're still contributing to the goal of our stimulus. So that's not necessarily junk work. Whereas if we were doing a strength program where we're doing, you know, 8 sets of 4 and we're trying to be, you know, at a super high intensity or, you know, work our way across, if we're doing 6 sets at like a 5 RPE, maybe that's just work that's making us tired, but maybe it's not contributing to our goal of getting stronger necessarily because we're not at a high enough intensity level for that particular program. So those would be kind of the more nuanced, I guess, types of junk volume. And then the most common one that people run into is, like you said, is just doing too much work, either in a session or across the entire week. And so this is where, your exercise selection becomes a little more important in understanding, like, am I just doing the same exercise multiple times? Am I, actually loading the different ranges or different positions of the muscle? But then in order to actually determine, like, am I doing too much? You really have to track your data. That's the only way to do it. Like, are you able to progress from week to week, either, in some form of whatever progressive overload method you're choosing, whether that's weights, reps, tempos, rest periods, whatever. Are you able to make some sort of reasonable progression to let us know that you at least fully recovered from the previous session? If it's, I made zero progress this week, or for 2 weeks in a row, or my weights went down, or I performed the same, but things seemed harder, or the weight just felt heavier today, those are probably indicators that you weren't fully recovered. Now, that could be nutrition, but if you're in a surplus and that's still happening, then likely you may have just overdone the volume, either the last time you trained that muscle or in total in the days since you last trained, because there's a nervous system recovery component as well. So does that kind of get us in the right direction?
Yeah.
I kind of rambled a little bit
For
there.
sure. And another question came up as you were talking about that. I get this a lot, is just kind of how you should adjust your training depending on what your goal is, right? So when it comes to fat loss versus, building muscle, and in the sense of, if you are in a surplus versus if you're in a deficit, what, in terms of like recovery wise, we just talked about how important it is to recover. So I guess, how would you answer that question, or how do you deal with that if you have a client who's going into a fat loss phase? Like, do you adjust their training? Like, how do you kind of deal with that? Obviously, everybody is their own individual, and it depends on that, but kind of on a general basis.
Mm-hmm. So part of it will depend on how aggressive we're being with our fat loss, whether we have a deadline, or maybe, sometimes I'll do this. I'll be like, hey, we're going to run an experiment, see how much of a deficit we can put you in, and find out where that floor is that you can still recover. And then we can use that data for later. So when we're typically if we go into like a really more aggressive kind of, energy deficit, the goal at that time is, for the training at least, is muscle preservation, right? We're not going to probably be building muscle if, we're 1,000 calories below our maintenance or whatever the number is. So our goal at that point is just, what is enough tension so that I'm least likely to lose my muscle tissue while I'm in this deficit. And then hopefully most of that, weight loss is, fat and water and those other things. Whereas if we're, maybe in a more conservative deficit, then maybe we, don't drop down the volume or the intensity or what have you as much. And maybe we can actually use the stimulus to our advantage to potentially accelerate the rate, either the rate of fat loss or the percentage of, fat loss that we're getting when we're in that deficit. So that's typically when we'd use more of some of the more metabolic types of stimuli, rather the systemic or local conditioning, which is, again, stuff that we talk about more in the courses, but driving certain metabolic pathways that are going to bias oxidizing more fat, conserving more glucose in the muscle tissue, and those types of things, where, sometimes we can have greater fluctuations in weight, which may or may not be a good thing. Again, that's we'd have to get more specific on the stimulus and all that type of stuff. Whereas if we're using more of a tension-based or a lower volume type approach, that's when we might be a little more aggressive with the deficit, and the training is just there to, again, preserve muscle tissue, maybe help us with nutrient partitioning. So maybe trying to help shuttle more of those carbohydrates we're taking in and put them in muscle tissue for glycogen, so we can use that for performance later, rather than, maybe storing it as body fat, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. That makes sense. And there's research out there on the amount of training that you need to do to be able to actually sustain or maintain your muscle mass, right? And I feel like at least one research review talks about like the percentage that you need. I don't know if like the percentage of how much volume you have to do to actually just maintain your muscle compared to what you normally do. Isn't it like 30% or something? Or am I just making that up?
I'm not sure, but I always have to take some of those studies as a grain of salt because I don't know how they design their programs and how they control for execution and exercise selection and all those other things that, we've been talking about. So it's like, well, I don't know how you do that. So I'm not sure how relevant this study is to what I'm actually doing. But I mean, typically, I'd say even like deep into contest prep, they're at least doing 50 to 60% of the same volume they'd be doing if they were doing hypertrophy. But again, I mean, the better you get at programming and periodizing some of this stuff, usually the easier it is to get to some of those levels of leanness without having to feel like you're dying. At least that's what I've been told by, some of the more recent people I've taken into those stages, and like, this was way easier than I've ever done it before. I'm like, well, that's good to hear.
Yeah. No, and that actually segues into kind of the last topic that I want to talk about, and we can kind of go through this one pretty quickly, but just in terms of research, like scientific research, like why, like you said, why do you need to take studies with a grain of salt unless you understand fully exactly what was going on within the study, all the variables, all of that? Like, and this is something that a lot of people get caught up on because they see someone post a study about whatever it is, and they're like, oh, that's it. I'm going to follow that. That's, it's science. So why is there like a disconnect there? Like, why do we have to take research, especially when it comes to nutrition, fitness, exercise, with a grain of salt? Can we talk a little bit about that?
Yep. Well, part of it is there's so many variables, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for the guys that try to design these studies and control for all of the things you need to control and all that stuff, because it's a headache. It's a lot of work. But again, we have the hard part with those studies is, one, you have the people that just read the abstract or the conclusion sentence on the abstract without maybe reading the study design. And if there was a major flaw somehow in the study design, then maybe that conclusion is less valid. And then you have the people that will read the summary of the person who read the abstract. And so they're getting like a secondhand summary of like, did they even understand the abstract, first of all? And then they're giving you a summary. And are you like, so it's like this game of telephone. So we have that. And I understand it's hard for people because there's so much info out there. People don't have time to spend 8 hours on PubMed reading through all of these things and the designs. And again, not all of them are free articles. You got to pay for some of them. But then the studies themselves is you have to understand the context of training and programming well enough to be able to pick apart what parts of these studies are useful and what may actually have a big flaw in it. And then especially for like some of the program design studies, again, it comes back to the control of the exercise selection and execution and those other things. I'll just give you an example of one of the EMG studies from, it was months ago, it was maybe almost a year ago. They were talking about different chest press variations, and they were talking about the EMG data. And this one actually had a picture of where they actually had pictures, which was, first of all, amazing. But then they actually showed pictures of the EMGs on the pecs. Now, when you run, the placement of the EMGs are very important. These EMGs, not only were they not all each on the correct divisions of the pecs or in the near, so typically you want them just off from the center of the muscle belly. Not only were they not on the correct divisions, they were rotated 90 degrees from what they should have been, which is a massive skew in the data they were collecting. So had we not seen that, we could have taken the data and been like, oh, okay, this is interesting. But then you look at how the thing was designed and the actual execution of the study itself, and you're like, well, that totally invalidates all of this other information you're giving me. This whole thing was garbage. But then you have people posting about this study because they don't know how an EMG is supposed to look, or what the division, like where they're supposed to be placed relative to the divisions. And they're like, oh, well, this is the best chest exercise because of this study. And you're like, can't use any of that data. It's worthless. And then you have, they'll pick 3 exercises and we're like, okay, was any of them a good exercise? Because if you're just comparing 3 garbage exercises, maybe you found out what was the best of the 3 garbage exercises. And then people go, well, this is the best chest exercise. It's like, that was the best of the 3, but what about the 20 other ones they didn't test?
Yeah.
Right. So, and maybe a good example is when we were talking about chest pressing, for example, at the practical. And we were talking about, not having your humerus out perpendicular to your torso for a chest press. We want it in a little bit closer to your torso. But if we have a study that does all of the presses out where your humerus is, almost perpendicular torso, and they're just changing the angle of the press, if you're pressing up more towards your head, straight forward or down, and they say, oh, well, this one had the best chest recruitment based on the data we collected. But what if they had just adducted that humerus, brought it in a little closer, and then tried it? It would have been a completely different result. So again, choosing 3 garbage exercises and you're getting the best of the 3 doesn't tell you that's the best chest exercise. So again, people need to understand, just because they picked these 3 exercises, those aren't the only 3 exercises for whatever muscle group they were testing. We have all these other things we have to consider. So yeah, the background, the context of the study, the variables that would need to be controlled for. There's a lot that goes into understanding studies and reading them. And I totally understand it is more of a headache than most people even want to think about or deal with. So that's why they come to people, coaches and things that just tell me what to do, because I don't have the time. I have a job. I have a life. I don't have the time to figure this out. You do it for me.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the issue. Like science, just people are like, oh, this is a published study, and so it must be the truth, right? So it just, I think you explained it very well with those examples. And yeah, it's like just taking everything with a grain of salt, and then also realizing too that most studies are, taking averages of people, and
that's the biggest
thing. You're not an average.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, that's why we have it on a t-shirt.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So it's like, okay, yeah, we got the average, but what if you are one of the outliers, or you're one standard deviation off? And it's like, and I mean, some of the outliers in some of the studies I've seen it's like, this guy got whatever, 10% muscle growth. Wow. He's an outlier. The average was whatever, 5%. But then you have these outliers who got they lost muscle mass. It's like, whoa, what if I'm one of these guys? I don't want to do this.
Yeah.
It's terrible.
Yeah. It's a lot. But yeah, no, that makes sense. Just for anybody listening, if you do, read research studies or see anybody post about a study, just always kind of, keep your ears up, and realize that it's not, yeah.
Probably the other thing is, if you do read one of those, is not trying to expand upon their conclusion to where it becomes false. So for an example would be talking about training frequency. They did some studies, and we have an article on this, is just they compared training 1 time a week to 2 times per week. And they said, okay, well, the people in the 2 times per week group, they had significantly more muscle growth on this program. So in this case, 2 times a week was better than 1. And then you had people starting to be like, oh, more frequency is better. And then you have people writing programs that it's like total body 5 times a week as promoted as a beginner hypertrophy program. I'm just like, you're going to kill somebody.
Boy.
Like,
oh my gosh.
Yeah. So it's not taking those to extrapolating into an erroneous conclusion by just like, oh, well, this is good, so more must be better. And, we've talked about that. So.
Yeah, exactly. Awesome. Well, I feel like we covered pretty much all the topics that I wanted to get into, which never happens. So that's awesome.
I just talked really fast.
No, and you explained everything really well. So, and if anybody listening, we kind of, some of the things we were talking through and making movements. If you're listening to this and not watching on YouTube, you can always go back and check out the YouTube video. That's linked in the show notes. So yeah, do you want to just tell our listener, do you have anything fun coming up, anything exciting coming up with N1 that you want to chat about? And then also just tell our listeners or viewers where they can find you.
Yeah. So right now I'm really excited about our next shipment of Prime Fitness equipment that should be coming in a little over a week now. So we've got 9 more pieces to play with. So all the new campers coming this year will have more things to be tortured on, which will be a lot of fun.
Oh man, I'll have to come back.
Yep. Well, you can do that.
I got tagged in a photo that Prime Fitness posted in the N1 facility for the rotate handles, and I was just like, oh, this is funny. But yeah,
you're
Prime
a celebrity
Fitness
now.
Yeah, celebrity. I was like, so can I get like a discount on some equipment if you're using my picture? No, I'm just kidding. But no, it was cool. But yeah, if you haven't heard of Prime Fitness, definitely look them up. Top-notch equipment all around.
And then, so if you guys are interested in checking out any of our information, we have n1.education on Instagram, which is more of the coaches-oriented education stuff. And then we have n1.training, which is more people just looking to, get in, train, feel good, build muscle, helpful tips, all that kind of stuff. And then the websites are exactly the same, n1.education and n1.trainingno.com. And then mine is just CJ Moxley on Instagram.
Awesome. I will definitely link all of those in the show notes and definitely check them out. You guys are always posting amazing content. Yeah, keep doing that. It's great. Very educational and very practical too. Like all the things that we just talked about. Even more kind of broken down, especially when you have pictures and graphics to kind of back it up. It's a lot easier to understand some of the things that we were talking about today. So definitely, check that out check M1 out on Instagram, their website, and I'll link Cody's Instagram as well in the show notes. And you guys are on TikTok now too, right? I think.
Yeah, finally bit the bullet.
Yeah,
so Kasim started the TikTok account, just kind of posting similar stuff for people who are on there. He lets a little more personality out on there, I think, now. So that's kind of fun.
Awesome. Yeah, I've been trying on TikTok, but it's just a whole other beast.
Yep.
So we'll see. Maybe one day I'll get the hang of it. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, and I'll talk to you soon, I hope.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Thanks so much for tuning in to another episode of MetFlex and Chill. I hope you enjoyed it. It would be awesome if you could give the show 5 stars and leave a review on iTunes. We're trying to get placed in the top 100 health podcasts, and the 5-star ratings and reviews are what can help make that happen. I'll add step-by-step directions for leaving a review in the show notes. I know it's a big ask, but it really helps. Thanks again. See you next time.